specifically on the climate element update. Are you going to lead the discussion, Jose, or Jenna?
I'm going to turn it over to Jenna. Jose Alvarez with Community Planning, filling in for Oliver, who's out of town this week. I'll turn it over to Jenna to introduce our consultant as well.
Good morning. For the record, Jenna Kay with Community Planning. Joining Jose and I today, we have Tracy Lunsford here in the room with us, and Beth Miller, who is online, with Parametrics, who are our technical consultants for the greenhouse gas sub-element as part of our climate work. And we are here today to provide an update on the comprehensive plan climate element, and we'll be particularly focusing on this greenhouse gas reduction piece of that work. Let's go to the next slide. So our plan for today is we're just going to quickly review where we're at in the timeline for development of the climate element, remind all of ourselves some of the key requirements of this work, and then we'll spend the bulk of our time with an introduction to this greenhouse gas reduction sub-element, what we've learned so far, and what our next steps are with that. And then we'll make sure there's time for questions at the end. I will note we do have a portion of our presentation that has a lot of data, so please feel free to stop us for clarifying questions as we move through those slides, but can discuss in more depth at the end. Next slide. Okay, and let's go to the next slide to look at the timeline. So this slide is just a reminder. You've seen this before. This is the high-level overview schedule of the whole comprehensive planning periodic update project. Check marks are showing tasks that have been completed so far. And we've circled 2 items in this timeline related to updates to the text and policies of the comprehensive plan. And this is where the climate element fits within the larger scope of this whole project, because the climate element would be adding new text and new policies into the comprehensive plan. Next slide. You've also seen this timeline before, which is our, again, high-level overview of for the development of the climate element. So we've done a lot of work getting started, and right now we are in those 2 rectangles that are shown in orange. So we have our advisory groups meeting regularly, and we are conducting community engagement with the broader community as well throughout the year, with the aim of having a draft climate element written by early 2025 so that it is ready to go for the adoption process during the second half of 2025. Next slide. So we were last before you to give you an update on the climate element about a month ago on June 5th, and we were focused on updates where we were at with public engagement and talked about the resilience sub-element. So we are back today to continue that informational update on the greenhouse gas reduction sub-element. So a lot of this is just sharing information with you. We don't have any specific questions or guidance that we need at this point, but we want to make sure we are bringing you all along with us as we work through the steps in this process. Next slide. And then this is also just another timeline reminder of the schedule of our broader public engagement work. We have had a community workshop since we last met with you on resilience, and we'll be wrapping up our early project community engagement work in the next few weeks so that we can shift to focus on the greenhouse gas reduction community engagement. Next slide. Okay, so just real quickly, we'll review some of the key requirements of this climate element work. So as you know, House Bill 1181 was passed into law last year, and Clark County is in the first wave of adopters of this legislation. So no county or city has implemented this bill yet ahead of us. The main things this legislation did is that it added a climate change and resiliency goal to the Growth Management Act. It requires Clark County to add a climate element into our comprehensive plan, and this element needs to address both greenhouse gas reduction and resilience. This legislation introduced new definitions into the Growth Management Act, and if you read through the 50 pages of the bill, there's a few key themes that stand out. One is a need to address environmental justice in the policies developed in the climate element, a need to use best available science, and a need to be consistent with the Commerce guidance on how local governments are to implement this legislation. And we have to do all of this by the end of 2025. Next slide. Since we'll be focusing on greenhouse gas reduction today, I just want to remind you all of a few of the key requirements of this portion of the bill. So the bill tells us we need to have a list of goals and policies that the county will be able to implement over the next 20 years that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions, reduce vehicle miles traveled per capita, so per person, and prioritize reductions that benefit our most vulnerable community members. When we get to the point in the process where we'll have goals and policies to bring to you for consideration, that proposal will also need to include targets of where the county is striving to be with reducing greenhouse gases and vehicle miles traveled. Washington State has a statewide goal to be net zero for greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2050. That was established in RCW 70A.45.020. And so since House Bill 1181 tells us we have to plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and be consistent with the Commerce guidance, the Commerce guidance is telling us we need to be consistent with this statewide goal. So the state has basically directed us to this 2050 target that our planning needs to be in alignment with. So part of our work with our project advisory groups will not only be to come up with some possible goals and policies to address the requirements on this slide, but also to propose some incremental targets throughout the 20-year comp plan planning period so that we can monitor and report on progress for greenhouse gas emissions reduction and vehicle miles traveled reduction. So that will be part of what we bring forward to you next year. But we have a lot of steps to take before we get to a point of having any idea of what those might be. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so now I'd like to pass the presentation to our project consultants. So again, Tracy Lunsford is here in the room and Beth Miller is online with Parametrics. And they're gonna provide a more detailed introduction to the greenhouse gas reduction element, share a bit about what we've learned so far, and tell us what's next. So over to you, Tracy and Beth.
Thank you, Jenna. Good morning, counselors. My name is Tracy Lunsford. I'm with Parametrics, as Jenna mentioned, and Parametrics is supporting the entire climate element, and we are leading the work on the greenhouse gas emissions reduction sub-element. So we have some information here for you today regarding what we've done so far on the project and what is coming up. Next slide, please. We will go over some basics for greenhouse gas inventory. We know this is the first inventory that Clark County has completed. We'll give you the results of what we've found, and then we'll talk about emissions reduction planning and what that process will look like for the county. And at this point, I'll turn it over to my colleague Beth Miller, who's online, to present the greenhouse gas inventory.
Hi, thank you very much for having me here. Are you able to hear me? Sure. Great. All right. So I'm going to start with a little GHG 101, GHG inventory 101, and then take you through the results that we filed. Next slide, please.
Could you get closer to your microphone? You're fading in and out, and I think we've amplified you as much as we can.
Okay, let's see. Let me see. I'll see if I can't. Is that any better?
Just stay consistently close to the microphone and keep your voice up. We'll all appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'll do my very best. Okay, so what is a GHG inventory? It's basically an accounting of all of the different sources of greenhouse gases released or removed during a specific period for a specific organization or geographic region or community. So in this case, we're looking at the geographic territory of Clark County all the unincorporated territory. GHGs are in large part from the burning of fossil fuels, but not exclusively from the burning of fossil fuels. They also include things like refrigerants, like leakage of refrigerants into the atmosphere, wastewater treatment, landfill waste, and land use change. Land use change being, in this context, mostly cutting down trees to develop that land. So that's the big mover of land use change here. We're mostly going to talk about carbon dioxide, but there are many different gases. Here you can see a table of the different important greenhouse gases and their sort of effect. Different greenhouse gases have different strengths of effects in the atmosphere. So methane, nitrous oxide, and then there's other very strong GHGs like those refrigerants that we talked about. So the purpose of this inventory is to provide a baseline so that you understand what's the situation before you go in and make reductions. So you know where the hot spots are. You can see where the low-hanging fruit is. You can understand where you start so you can see where you go. So you can actually track your progress through time. Next slide. So in this inventory, we sort of add all those different gases up and count them as metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, MTCO sub 2E. So 1 metric ton of CO2e is roughly the size of a house, just to give an idea about how much it is that we're talking about. And it's equivalent to 1 passenger vehicle being driven for 2,500 miles, about 13% of a home's energy usage, or about 46 propane cylinders used on your barbecue, or 1.2 acres of forest sequestration for a year. Next. So for this inventory, this is sort of an overview of what we count in this inventory. And we follow both the Washington State Department of Commerce requirements. So they lay out exactly what sources they want you to count. And then we also use the GPC protocol, the Global Greenhouse Gas Protocol for Communities, to aid us in making sure that we count everything consistently. So scope 1 emissions are those emissions that are sort of, sometimes we talk about them as tailpipe emissions. This is what comes out of the smokestack. This is what comes out of the tailpipe. So this is all industrial processes within your boundary. This is agricultural, cow burps within your boundary. And then the natural gas that you burn in your house and your cars, things like that. Scope 2 is just for electricity. So usually that is generated outside of the community and used inside of the community. So the emissions associated with electricity are scope 2. And then scope 3 is everything that you sort of is produced elsewhere or someone else has control over, but you use in your community. So this is everything that you buy. This is also any waste that gets sent out of the community to a different landfill somewhere else. And then, so those are like all the different sources. We're doing this for calendar year 2022. And like I said, it's just for the unincorporated county. We also did this for a few cities within the county, but today we're just going to talk about the unincorporated county. And then to sort of aid in planning purposes and reductions, we split it up by urban unincorporated, which is really anything within the UGA. So all of those areas like outside of Vancouver that are not incorporated into Vancouver but are owned by the county, and then rural, like all the rural unincorporated, everything that's not within a UGA is not likely to be incorporated into a city anytime soon. there any questions about sort of those boundaries and the process before I get going with the results?
Any questions, council, at this point?
Yeah, I have one
Please
quick
go ahead.
question.
Go ahead.
I was curious, so on slide 14, you know, when we talk about the impact of the different gases, they're obviously different. I was curious, so where methane is listed as 28, is that just pure methane? And I know when it's burnt, it changes. And how does it change when it's burned?
Yeah, when you burn methane, you make CO2 and H2O. So basically, once it's burned, it's mostly CO2. So then it has a different impact than methane that's just escaping into the air. So like cow burps are methane, and leakage from your natural gas system is methane, but what you burn, what is actually gets burned, is CO2.
Do we know like so I mean, just methane is 28, but do we know what it becomes after it's burned?
Yeah, once it gets burned, it becomes carbon dioxide, and then it's just one.
Just one?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's huge.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it is
All right, thank you.
very important to not let it leak if your intention is to burn it.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Other questions? Okay, we can continue on.
Right, so let's get to the results. Next slide. Okay, so this is just the local emissions from building energy, transportation, agriculture and land use and forestry, industrial processes and product use, and solid waste and wastewater. So this is the overall distribution among these, and then I'm going to go through each sector one by one to sort of tell you exactly what is included in each of those different colored boxes. So the largest sources of emissions are building energy and transportation, which is pretty typical what we see. Then it's agriculture, forestry, and land use, and then followed by a little bit of basically refrigerant usage and waste. And all of those together come to nearly 1.5 million metric tons of CO2e. And this is about 6.1 metric tons per person. Next slide. And then, so that's just sort of the scope 1 emissions. Now, if we think about the things that Clark County uses that are produced elsewhere, so someone else has made these emissions on your behalf. So all the goods produced, the food produced, air travel outside of the community, and then all the production of all the fuel that you burn comes to quite a bit more. So that is 2.5 million metric tons of CO2e, and that's 10 metric tons CO2e per capita. So this is a very large source for the community, and we see that especially in communities like this one where their electricity is relatively low carbon. Their imported goods tend to be a bigger share of their emissions. Next. All right, so this is sort of breaking it out by rural versus urban usage. And I mean, and lots of this comes just down to population. The building energy and transportation, and you can see compared to the waste and processes, and then all that land use, that's all from forest loss in the rural areas. And then compare that to the different portions of goods, food, fuel, and air travel. The next section is, so let's sort of dive into where all this stuff comes from. Building energy emissions, again, 36% of the total county emissions. Most of that is from electricity, and that's, fairly evenly split between urban and rural. Natural gas is more prevalent in the urban areas than in the rural areas. So you see a lot bigger signature of natural gas in the urban parts of the unincorporated county. And then a little bit, the other includes things like propane, fuel oil, all those other things that you might burn to keep your house warm or make a barbecue or something like that. Next slide, please. In the next section, also 36% of the total is transportation emissions. So in this case, we've got sort of these side-by-side pies. So most of these emissions come from passenger cars, as you can see. And then the sort of second biggest chunk is just from purchased air travel. And the air travel is entirely by income, basically, using average air travel based on community income distributions. Then we've got some off-road diesel usage, and then some freight diesel. So those are the big trucks that come through. And yeah, so all of the gasoline and freight diesel usage are all estimated based on vehicle miles traveled within the boundary. Right, next. All right, so the next biggest sector is AFLU, so agriculture, forestry, and land use. And in this case, it's almost entirely from net forest carbon loss. So this is estimated by looking at satellite images of the county, looking over the past 20 years and looking at changes in canopy cover. So over the past 20 years, per year, there's been a net loss on average of about 227,000 metric tons CO2e. The next biggest section is livestock. So that's, again, just like cows and animal waste is most of that. And then there's soil amendment. So this is nitrogen fertilizer, which has its own GHG emissions from that nitrous oxide. One more thing about sort of that forestry. I said that it's net. So there's both emissions that come from losing tree cover, and then there's the remaining forest, as you can see, is doing a lot of sequestration work. So it's important to note that there's a lot of sequestration happening from a large amount of forest happening. So it's not like the forests are some kind of like terrible source. They are both a source and a sink, but on net, there has been some forest loss. Next slide. Okay, and then this sector is, we call it industrial process and product use. And sometimes this involves some industrial emissions, but in this case, this is all from refrigerants. So this is from the AC in your car. This is from AC in homes. This is, grocery stores have big, huge refrigerators. All of those sources have a slight rate of leakage, and this is estimated based per population based on the state averages. Next. Okay, and then the last one, landfill solid waste and wastewater emissions. So the solid waste emissions come from emissions from the landfill where the waste is taken to. So some of that's collected as methane and used to make electricity, but some of it escapes. So that's where those solid waste emissions come from. And then there's wastewater treatment. And then there's emissions from septic beds. Next. And then this is sort of a big, huge breakdown of everything, everything that everyone buys and the relative emissions from each of those kinds of things that you buy. And again, this this section is estimated based on income distribution within the community. So the more money you make, the more you buy. And so higher incomes are associated with higher Scope 3 consumption of food and goods emissions. So that's how the food and goods are estimated. Fuel production is estimated based on the fuel used, both electricity, natural gas, and vehicle fuels. So everything that it takes to make those fuels upstream. And then again, air travel is based on income. Right, next. I would like to see if anybody has any questions, and I'm happy to go in more depth or explain more things.
Any questions at this point, Council? Obviously, we'll have plenty of time at the end, once we get there, to ask questions or make comments. Hearing none, please continue.
Thank you. So now understanding what the breadth of your emissions are in Clark County, we want to talk about what is required, what is the ultimate goal of the climate emissions reduction sub-element, which is to reduce those emissions. So it's important to start with the foundation of what the emissions are so that you know where it is that you need to focus energy on identifying options for reducing those emissions. So just starting with a quick definition here, greenhouse gas emissions reduction is taking action to reduce or eliminate the emissions of greenhouse gases in order to reduce the rate and extent of climate change damage. So this process requires identifying and adopting effective actions that will reduce the emissions that are being released. And it's important to keep in mind that the slide that Jenna shared before states that Washington State has a goal of reducing all greenhouse gases in the state to net zero by 2050. That's in the requirements of this legislation. And then also to follow best science. And best science indicates that we need to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels to avoid severe climate hazards and reduce the risk associated with long-lasting and irreversible changes such as the loss of some ecosystems. And in our environment today, we're already seeing the consequences of about 1 degree Celsius increase over those pre-industrial levels. And that is manifesting in what we all experience as extreme weather, rising sea levels, diminishing Arctic sea ice, and other things, the other hazards that you were briefed on in June. So that is the reason why we're working on reducing these greenhouse gases. So the process overall on the next slide is takes place over the course of multiple steps. The first one is to complete that greenhouse gas inventory. So that really helps identify the local emission sources and quantify them. And then it highlights where the sources are for potential mitigation that the entity, in this case, unincorporated Clark County, should focus on. The second step, and what we will be doing next, is identifying measures. And again, we'll be focusing in those high impact sectors and the low hanging fruit. So the easy things to do, the quick things to do, the things that are ready, the technology is ready now for implementing those greenhouse gas emissions reductions measures. Once we've identified the measures, we'll go through a prioritization process using multi-criteria analysis. This is a process that's defined by the Department of Commerce in the guidance that we're given on this climate element. But it's important to keep in mind that there are lots of examples of proven and effective actions that can reduce greenhouse gases. And the primary focus will be on greenhouse gas reduction, but there are also lots of other co-benefits that come with taking these actions. And our team, and through this process, we will seek to maximize those co-benefits. And those can include things like doubling as resilience measures. For example, weatherization of housing is a potential measure that we could consider, and that would also help people deal with more extreme weather events at the same time. So that's an example of a co-benefit. We could also see things that that create jobs, improve the health of residents in the area, provide ecosystem benefits and other things. So we'll be seeking to maximize those co-benefits along with the greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So we'll identify those measures, go through a prioritization process with the Community Advisory Group and the Environmental Justice Coalition. And then our teams will be evaluating the effectiveness of the prioritized measures among multiple criteria. And then we will use the equity lens that the Environmental Justice Coalition has developed to ensure that we're meeting that other requirement of the legislation to prioritize equity and environmental justice. So we'll use the equity lens on those measures in order to make sure that we've identified any equity considerations related to them. The fourth step in this process is to set emissions reductions targets. As I mentioned before, Washington has a statewide target of net zero emissions by 2050. So that doesn't mean that we can't do anything. It just means that on the net, so including sequestration activities, we would have zero emissions. And so we will be looking at different targets for each sector for Clark County to get to that net zero overall goal. And then the final step is to integrate this into the comprehensive plan. Again, this is one chapter of the overall comp plan. And then it will, as ongoing work, updating the greenhouse gas inventory regularly to track progress toward and the effectiveness of the measures that have been selected. And that is our overall presentation and the information, the status that we wanted to share with you, and a little bit of idea of what is coming up next. So we can take questions, and I'll turn it back over to Jenna to wrap us up.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add, except we're glad to answer questions.
Council, what are your questions or comments?
I have
Glenn, go ahead. Let me go ahead. I recognize Glenn. Go ahead, Glenn.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. You know, we have a big task in front of us, and, you know, I attended the open house that was, or at least one of the open houses that was one of the elementary schools. And I share this not in a way to criticize any work or anything, but to bring awareness to an issue. And I had to leave that meeting, which, by the way, it was, from what I saw, about a half of it, I think, it was a great meeting and a pretty good turnout. I left the meeting early because I had another meeting to go to. And when I went out, I drive an electric car, and so I kind of noticed electric cars. And when I went outside, I was shocked. I'm like, wow, look at the electric cars here. And there were 12 electric cars and 37 total cars. So about 30% of the cars were electric. So, and you can kind of associate electric cars with people that are interested in this topic that we're discussing. So the reason I bring
I'm
this,
hoping you're not insulting people who are not driving electric.
no.
That would really not be good.
I'd love to continue. Thank you. My point is that when we're making decisions on reductions, I think that's very scientifically driven. But when we make the decisions on how to make those reductions, that's where the impacts come in. And my concern is that and this is so hard, and again, this is why I'm saying it's not criticizing in any way, but it is so hard to get people into these meetings, into these forums and open houses that are going to be significantly impacted by the changes, but aren't necessarily interested in this issue. And so my question would be, how do we capture those people that are going to be impacted so that they can weigh in on the decisions we make on how we reduce the emissions?
Well, I think there's a few ways, and, you know, we'll be far from perfect, but we'll do our best. One of the reasons we set up our community advisory group to be a really diverse range of people with a variety of interests is to at least have some representation from a lot of different perspectives in the county where maybe this isn't a top priority and maybe some other priorities. So I think we do have a really nice mix in that community advisory group to challenge each other, push back, talk about, well, but what about these impacts and things like that. So I think that's one way we're helping, but again, that's only 20 people, right, for the whole county. And then I think in our broader public engagement, we are, you know, I think like for resilience, we're trying to talk about severe weather because, so we're trying to make it more approachable, if possible, that it might be more appealing to engage with for people who, again, the word climate change may be a turnoff, but trying to talk about the things that we all experience and interact with every day. So for resilience, we were talking about severe weather, you know, for greenhouse gas reduction, talking more about pollution and things like that. So changing our terminology a little bit might open, you know, involvement with some people, but so that's one way. And then I think a lot of the details on the how, right, are going to come later too on the actual, when we get to the details of implementing policies that we come up with. So a lot of work to do in the future.
Yeah, and just, it reminds me of a situation of my own where, you know, parking was removed on our street in order to put bike lanes in, and nobody in the neighborhood was interested because they didn't understand how it was going to impact them. And of course, the community that's interested in bicycling was attending all of the meetings that were relative to that. So it's one of those situations where we've got to work really hard to somehow trigger and capture people to get their participation so that we can get if we don't have their input, then that's when mistakes are made, you know. So I appreciate it, look forward to it. It's an incredibly challenging, daunting task to capture those people. I appreciate any efforts that are made.
Other questions or comments by council?
I have
Okay, Sue, you go ahead, please.
comment and a question. One thing I just wanted to let you know, if you didn't know about already, is the Healthy Communities program of the health department is doing a heat watch voluntary survey of the county this Friday to identify heat islands, which I think could be very complementary information to the work that you're doing. So I just wanted to, if you weren't aware, make you aware of that. There'll be some information coming forward. You know, I'm curious about the more urban versus rural strategies, because I've always thought the rural could be a good part of the solution in terms of mitigation and resilient strategies. Will there be more of a focus on urban or rural, or you're really looking at the entire county?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Counselor. We have not determined that we're focusing on one area of the county or another, but we know that there are different circumstances, challenges, opportunities that present themselves based on the density of the area or the services that are available or the other geographic or location-based characteristics. And so that's why we've separated the urban and the rural, so that we can make sure that we're not missing strategies to apply to both urban and rural portions of the county, and also that we're keeping in mind how a particular strategy might be applied differently in different areas if they're based on the circumstances of the urban or rural. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons we had requested that the consultants try to split out the inventory was also to just make sure we had that information. I think a lot of the time, planning for the unincorporated area, we get data where it's all combined. And I think this was an instance where we, just guessing what the inventory might show, that we want to make sure we understand. We know there's less industry, right, in the rural area than there is in the urban area, and things like that. So I think wanted to have that information to be able to do what Tracy was just explaining.
Great, thank you.
Further questions? All right, I have a few comments, and I had prepared comments as you were doing your notes, but then Glenn Young's comments causing me to divert a little bit, because I will tell you, as politely as possible, there are a lot of intelligent, caring people that educate themselves, that do research, who simply cannot afford an electric vehicle. And so what your comments could really be taken the wrong way, that, hey, you need to drink from the Kool-Aid. There are people that just cannot afford an electric vehicle. It's not where it needs to be yet. And a lot of people recognize that. Aviation's moving towards electric, especially regional transportation, but, weight and balance, payload. Batteries are a real hindrance. And if you look at some of these surface mining that goes on for lithium and other areas, and the processing for those batteries that go into electric vehicles, it is a toxic dump that no one knows what to do with yet, or what to do with the used lithium batteries that are no longer valuable. So there's a lot of caring people out there that simply haven't bought into the all-electric vehicle yet. And which I want to transition now to more of what I wanted to say, because it's related. We need to be pragmatic. I'm hoping that becomes the hallmark of what Clark County is seeing as we grapple with this element, and I want to emphasize it's a sub-element. As we grapple with this element in our comprehensive plan, I'm hoping we can set the stage for all of Washington State, as other states are watching what we do with our GMA and this element as well. Pragmatism. Your average citizen in Clark County should not be shouldering the burden for all of Washington State's pollution, or for the nation's pollution, or for other nations' pollutions. We have to be pragmatic. Our taxpayers should not be shouldering this burden exclusively in ways that are not reasonable. I'm trying not to deliver the wrong message. I believe in this element. It is an important sub-element. We need to look through a lens to do the best we can, but it is not the only lens. And by the way, forest fires in Canada produce more from a single event and carbon dioxide loading in Southern California than all of Washington State in a year or even a lifetime when you look at Clark County. And then look at other nations as well. We cannot shoulder the burden impractically. An example, miles traveled. It's a Washington State goal to reduce that. We have 70,000 people commuting right now to Oregon every workday. What's that carbon footprint look like? Besides the fact that people are sitting in traffic jam for a good portion of their workday, going there and coming back. So it's environmental sub-element is not a single lens. You need to look at it in relationship to lands for jobs, our railroad. It's not about just moving commodities on the railroad and getting them off the road. And by the way, look at that carbon footprint. Freight rail is renowned for reducing carbon footprint, even with diesel engines. I'm not talking about electric freight. But you compare that to freight, you compare that to other diesel and gas vehicles on our roadways. Rail reduces the cost per mile, not only the actual cost, but the carbon footprint cost. But we're not talking about that with Lands for Jobs. It's not just the commodities, getting them off our roadway. It's creating family wage, local industry, so people don't have to commute. So our rural community has local jobs. That's what the rail line, and that's the buildable lands model for jobs. They all relate to one another. We can't look at anything for smart growth without relating them all together. So I appreciate the tenor and what you're doing, and the fact that you're paving the way for the state. And for those of us that don't have the disposable income to afford electric vehicles, you know, I assume most of our legislators seem to do that because they're really heavily burden us in Washington State with an emphasis on this that to some extent is not practical. So let's be pragmatic in all we do. All these decisions will really come to fruition next year, but I'm hoping staff really keeps an open view to relate what's reasonable. What can we burden our local population with that's pragmatic? So I'm hoping we get the reputation with our final product for having set the way for implementing this sub-element in a very reasonable and pragmatic way. Other comments or questions before we
Yes, one.
thank staff? Yes, Karen Bowerman.
I agree with what you have just said, Chair Medviji. And one of the areas that I've been interested in for some time is the use of the lithium battery. We know that there have been fires in Washington State resulting from the use of those and the transport of those lithium batteries, and that is a problem in itself. I am wondering if you know if there is production of lithium batteries either in our county or in the state, and if there is disposal of lithium batteries in our county or in our state.
This is Jenna. That's something we can double check. This has come up in our community advisory group, and so we have been trying to do some research on this. We've been talking to the Department of Natural Resources also to understand where mining is happening in the state. I will say on my radar right now, I don't believe there's any production in the county, but we are trying to double check that because it's come up as well from other folks.
And thank you. And if it is not in the county, but if it is in the state, because the state is imposing various rules on our county, I would think it would be time to turn around and suggest to our legislative group some things that the state could in fact do to help make meaningful controls in this area if in fact this kind of activity is going on in our state. It is probably as great a producer and will be in the future of various types of emissions as what come from other sources. And so if that is ignored by state after state, wherever this is going on, we're not having an impact that we could and should have, because we know that climate change is not contained within our own county. It is influenced by what happens around us as well. So that's just my comment.
Okay, well, I think this is among the hardest things your staff is doing as part of the comprehensive plan update, at least from my point of view, because it's so hard and complicated and related to other aspects of the comprehensive plan, and the fact that there's no precedent for anybody doing it. So thank you for the work that you're doing and the effort that you're putting into this and the community outreach that you're doing. And of course, we want the public to participate as much as possible. And so continue the great work. And I'll be reading about it in the newspaper in 2025 when the council is finally, hopefully, also making pragmatic decisions based on the work that you're doing today. Thank you so much for the presentation. And I do believe that concludes our work sessions this morning. So we'll be in recess until our council time at 1. We'll see you back then.